thought I would offer a video about Paul and leadership. We have had an opportunity as a class to meet. Some of us have across the last few months. Others have not had that opportunity because of work or whatever responsibilities you have. And I know it's a distance learning class, and so I wanted to. In the last few weeks, I want to try to pull together some of the readings that we've been doing and give you an example of how you can learn how to not only relate to the readings, but also draw from them and maybe learn a bit of a method of how to use Paul as a leadership example and lessons that we can learn from Paul on leadership. Certainly, Paul's not the only example. From the Gospels, Jesus, you could study maybe one of the disciples. The book of Proverbs is chock full of leadership maxims that could be used. So there are plenty of possibilities. I just wanted to get you to think with me in a reflective way, and even with critical thinking as to how we might look at Paul, his life, and how he exerted great leadership in many cases, and things that we could learn from Paul. Romans, the letter to the Romans is one of the finest examples. There's so many good examples in the book of Romans of leadership. I thought I would offer just a very brief lecture pertaining to Paul and his leadership, especially coming out of Romans 14 and then back into Romans 12. Chapter 12, and so you can certainly go there and look at those chapters if that will be helpful in the future. So, what I wanted to do is talk about the leadership challenge that Paul faced, especially with a community that seemed to be fairly divided over issues, and how a leader can be, to use Edwin Friedman's example, a leader can be self-differentiated. You can have a kind of you could be a leader who is exerting a calm presence, a presence that helps people work through their issues. Or leaders can, in many ways, end up being like a voltage amp where people's emotional systems get amped up and make it worse. Paul recognizes in leadership that what he's facing is a challenge, because he's facing a congregation that is both Jew and Gentile in Rome. In many ways cosmopolitan in their viewpoint, and there were some pretty serious issues happening. So what does Paul do as a leader, and how does he help? Well, I would point you to Romans 14 and tell you that sort of the context, the backstory of this, is that here is a group of people that were supposed to be together in one body, the body of Christ, the church. And they were supposed to be united, and they were supposed to be working together. But in reality, what was happening, many of them were exerting their own rights and privileges. And I'll explain that a little bit more. It has a lot to do with culture and a lot to do with the cultural background you came from, the Greek and then the Jew. As in the background that someone comes from. So these people were divided over their opinions and their beliefs. They had forgotten the spirit of mutuality and certain respect and love that they were supposed to have for each other as Christians. And in Romans 14, the Christians at Rome were quarreling over opinions. Some of those opinions had to do with could you eat meat that had been offered to idols. Now, I realize that doesn't sound like a very relevant topic for our time. None of us go to the grocery store and find something marked off at Publix in the meat from the meat counter, a meat that had been offered to idols. But this is the way it worked in the marketplace. Meat that had been an animal that had been sacrificed in some pagan worship service had been used as an idol. Or offered at the altar of an idol, then that meat would have been collected and taken to market, and you could buy it at a reduced rate. And certainly for many of the Greeks, many of the Gentile believers in Rome, they saw no problem with this. They had no problem with it. Why would there be an issue? Why would there be an issue with meat that had been offered to an idol? We don't, as a Christian, they wouldn't believe in idols any longer. The Jews would have perhaps felt otherwise about it. And of course, it could have gone the other way as well. It could have gone back and forth. But nonetheless, they were divided over their opinion about could they eat meat that had been offered to idols or not. And some were even saying, because of kosher laws, maybe vegetarian was the way to go. And that wasn't the only thing they were divided over. They were divided over the day of worship. Which day is holy? Which day is the Sabbath? Should it be Saturday or Sunday? And how do you keep a day holy? And how do you come together over an issue like that? They were divided over and were also passing judgment on each other over many different issues. Paul writes very directly into this and says, you know what? Let us no longer pass judgment on one another, but resolve instead never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of another. And what he's doing is he's leading, and he's teaching them the principle of mutuality, that they are together, they are a community, that out of respect and love for other people, you sometimes lay your own rights and privileges down so that you won't be a stumbling block, so that, it even goes into detail in some of this by saying, you know what, if some of you feel like it's all right to eat meat offered to idols, as long as it's not a stumbling block. But if it's a stumbling block, then don't do it. And he applies that principle. As a matter of fact, he goes on and writes, let us then pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. He's trying to remind them of their opportunity to live together in harmony, to live together in peace, and at the same time their responsibility to build each other up. He's offering great leadership here because this is a group of people that easily could have come unhinged. They could have come apart. And yet he is reminding them in sort of a direct way that they are to be together in one body. They should not be using their rights and privileges in ways that would tear someone down or be a stumbling block for someone else. Hey, again, he's teaching the principle of mutuality, which is so very important. Now, he goes on to offer other kinds of leadership tips that I wanted to draw from Romans chapter 12. And some things that I think will help in leadership. This is one way to kind of read Paul and draw lessons and applications for maybe our own leadership challenges that we face in life. So he talks about the principle of humility in Romans 12. This is what he says. By the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more of yourself, or not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. He recognizes that the one thing that will destroy the spirit of mutuality and community as quickly as anything is the spirit of pride and of ego and of asserting my own rights. And Paul is teaching the principle of humility. He also teaches in Romans 12, I'm drawing these lessons from Romans 12, he teaches the principle of unity found in the midst of great diversity. Listen to what he says in Romans 12. For as in one body we have many members, and not all members have the same function. He's reminding them that they belong together. They are one body, the body of Christ, and yet they have different gifts, different responsibilities to live out, and so he's reminding them of that. He also teaches them the principle of mutual affection. Let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another with mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor, do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord. All of these things are things that he taught to the Romans. And I'm offering this again as leadership principles that Paul is teaching them how to live together. So you have the spirit of humility, the principle of unity in the midst of diversity, the power of mutual affection, and then of course this is another thing, a leadership thing that he's offering to the Romans that I think is so very important and in many ways is brilliant in what he says. Listen to this. He talks about breaking the cycle of hostility. And he's talking really about pursuing peace and living together peacefully within the congregation or community. But this is what he said. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty. Do not repay evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. You realize what he's saying, that they are to live together in community, and if they're going to live in harmony with one another, they have to be able and know how to break the cycle of hostility. If someone wrongs you, if they even persecute you, you bless them. You don't curse them. You don't return evil with evil. You don't do that. You return evil with good. Why? Because that is the only way to break the cycle of hostility. And that's a lesson we could be teaching today, right? Given what's happening, the rhetoric that occurs in our world, in our time. But Paul is offering leadership lessons again. And finally, he offers this lesson in Romans 12, and that is how to take responsibility for yourself, taking personal responsibility. Listen to his words. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, you hear the words, so long as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Paul isn't trying to simply spiritualize certain things that are happening. He's actually trying to teach them how to live together in harmony and how to be community. And he recognizes that, the future is at stake. That if the church at Rome is to ever make a difference, if they're ever going to become what they have the potential to become, they have to learn to live together and to bridge the gap, the differences that exist. And the only way to do it, as he reminds them, is through a spirit of humility. They have to learn that there is unity in the very midst of diversity, that they're one body, they're connected to each other. They have to learn how to really have a sense of mutual affection, a genuine sense of love for one another. They have to learn how to break the cycle of hostility when those moments occur in their community. And they also, each one of them, have to learn to take personal responsibility for their life and how they live it. If it promotes peace, if it builds up others, then it's helpful. If it doesn't, then it does damage. And that's important. There's a lot riding on this for Paul and those early Christians, more than we recognize. And so I thought I'd offer this as a way to kind of delve into, look at some of Paul's writings and how chock full of wisdom they are for leadership. Now, there's a lot I could talk about here. I mean, humility, the principle of humility. And that starts with a leader. If a leader is proud or arrogant, for one, a lot of people aren't going to approach it. A lot of people are never going to tell you what you need to hear. But if you exhibit a spirit of humility, Jim Collins talks about level 5 leaders as people who have a spirit of humility, a willingness to be humble and approachable. That's important for a leader. A leader has to be someone who recognizes that there is a great deal of diversity. One of the real challenges of leadership, how do you lead people who are so different from each other, who have differing opinions, who honestly, many of them, they don't, how do you get people to work together? And how do you do that in a nonprofit organization where people don't have to really follow you and they don't have to listen to you? They don't have to do what you tell them to do. And how do you lead in that situation? And so also the challenge of being able to genuinely exhibit a spirit of love and affection for people that you're trying to lead, and yet do that in a self-differentiated way, a way that recognizes that you are both an individual and you have rights to your own opinions. You may not agree with everything that's happening, but at the same time, you recognize that you're also connected, that you're not disconnected from that community, that organization. And then finally, how to break the cycle of hostility. When it comes to leadership, I think the way to do that, you have to model that as a leader. If you want that really to become a reality in a group, you have to be able to model that day by day in leadership. And that's never easy. That sounds easy. It's not easy. Leaders are as prone to having tempers and having opinions and having wanting the last word, wanting to win an argument. All of those things, leaders aren't exempt from any of those things. You have to learn how to do this. You have to learn how to live this in your own life and be effective. And then finally, learning to take responsibility. And that is living your life as a leader in a way that to live at peace with people, promote togetherness, not in the codependent way, but